I'm Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. This is the final episode in our three-part series covering the planting of English America. Tonight, our Historytellers will look at the colonizing of the Carolinas and the inevitable split as North Carolina emerged from the wilderness. We'll take a look at Georgia, used as a buffer to Spanish encroachment from Florida, and finally the plantation system that became the economic cornerstone of British colonization. Starting off tonight is Rebecca McMurran, who reports on the colonization of the Carolinas.
The Carolinas were conceived and organized with one priority in mind: profit. Nowhere else in the English colonies of North America did all the necessary factors exist to create unprecedented wealth with very little risk to investment. A long growing season, endless tracts of fertile land, and a labor force of slaves all created a system of economy that would become the foundation of American capitalism. While a civil war convulsed England in the 1640s, King Charles I had dismissed Parliament in 1629, and when he eventually recalled it in 1640, the members were mutinous. Finding their great champion in the Puritan soldier Oliver Cromwell, they ultimately beheaded Charles in 1649, and Cromwell ruled England for nearly a decade. Finally, Charles II, son of the decapitated king, was restored to the throne in 1660. Colonization had been interrupted during this period of bloody unrest. Now, in the so-called Restoration period, empire building resumed with even greater intensity, and royal involvement. Carolina, named for Charles II, was formally created in 1670, after the king granted to 8 of his court favorites, the Lords Proprietors, an expanse of wilderness ribboning across the continent to the Pacific. These aristocratic founders hoped to grow food stores to provision the sugar plantations in Barbados and to export non-English products like wine, silk, and olive oil. Carolina prospered by developing close economic ties with the flourishing sugar islands of the English West Indies. In a broad sense, the mainland colony was but the most northerly of those outposts. Many original Carolina settlers in fact had emigrated from Barbados, bringing that island's slave system with them. They also established a vigorous slave trade in Carolina itself. Enlisting the aid of the coastal Savannah Indians, they forayed into the interior in search of captives. The Lords Proprietors in London protested against Indian slave trading in their colony, but to no avail. Manacled Indians soon were among the young colonized major exports. As many as 10,000 Indians were dispatched to lifelong labor in the West Indian cane fields and sugar mills. Others were sent to New England. One Rhode Island town in 1730 counted more than 200 Indian slaves from Carolina in its midst. In 1707 the Savannah Indians decided to end their alliance with the Carolinians and to migrate to the backcountry of Maryland and Pennsylvania, where a new colony founded by Quakers under William Penn promised better relations between whites and Indians. But the Carolinians determined to thin the savannas before they could depart. A series of bloody raids all but annihilated the Indian tribes of coastal Carolina by 1710. After much experimentation, rice emerged as the principal export crop in Carolina. In those days rice was an exotic food in England. No rice seeds were sent out from London in the first supply ships to Carolina. But rice was grown in Africa, and the Carolinians were soon paying premium prices for West African slaves experienced in rice cultivation. The Africans' agricultural skill and their relative immunity to malaria made them ideal laborers on the hot and swampy rice plantations. By 1710 they constituted a majority of Carolinians. Moss Festoon Charlestown, also named for the king, rapidly became the busiest seaport in the South. Many high-spirited sons of English landed families, deprived of an inheritance, came to the Charleston area and gave it a rich aristocratic flavor. The village became a colorfully diverse community, to which French Protestant refugees and others were attracted by religious toleration. Nearby, in Florida, the Catholic Spaniards abhorred the intrusion of these Protestant heretics. Carolina's frontier was often aflame. Spanish-incited Indians brandished their tomahawks, and armor-clad warriors of Spain frequently unsheathed their swords during the successive Anglo-Spanish wars. But by 1700 Carolina was too strong to be wiped out. For the Historytellers, I'm Rebecca McMurran.
North Carolina was born, so to speak, as a byproduct of cultural conflict. The size of the original land grant allowed for people to cheaply acquire new real estate. Over time, those people outnumbered and outgunned the native populations of the region. They also developed a distinctly different set of cultural values. The wild, northern expanse of the huge Carolina land grant, bordered on Virginia. From the older colony, there drifted down a ragtag group of poverty-stricken outcasts and religious dissenters. Many of them had been repelled by the atmosphere of Virginia, dominated as it was by big plantation gentry who overwhelmingly belonged to the Church of England. North Carolinians, as a result, had been called the quintessence of Virginia's discontent. The newcomers, who frequently were squatters without legal right to the soil, raised their tobacco and other crops on small farms, with little need for slaves. Distinctive traits developed rapidly in North Carolina. The poor, but sturdy inhabitants, regarded as riffraff by their snobbish neighbors, earned a reputation for being irreligious and hospitable to pirates. Isolated from neighbors by raw wilderness and stormy Cape Hatteras, known to mariners as the graveyard of the Atlantic, the North Carolinians developed a strong spirit of resistance to authority. Their location between aristocratic Virginia and aristocratic South Carolina caused the area to be dubbed a vale of humility between two mountains of conceit. Following much friction with governors, North Carolina was officially separated from South Carolina in 1712, and subsequently each segment became a royal colony. North Carolina shares with tiny Rhode Island several distinctions. These two outposts were the most democratic, the most independent-minded, and the least aristocratic of the original 13 English colonies. Although Northern Carolina, unlike the colony's southern reaches, did not at first import large numbers of African slaves, both regions shared in the ongoing tragedy of bloody relations between Indians and Europeans. Tuscarora Indians fell upon the fledgling settlement at New Bern in 1711. The North Carolinians, aided by their heavily armed brothers from the south, retaliated by crushing the Tuscaroras in battle, selling hundreds of them into slavery and leaving the survivors to wander northward to seek the protection of the Iroquois. The Tuscaroras eventually became the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. In another ferocious encounter 4 years later, the South Carolinians defeated and dispersed the Yamasee Indians. By 1720 the coastal Indian tribes in the southern colonies had been utterly devastated. Yet in the interior, in the hills and valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, the powerful Cherokees, Creeks, and Iroquois remained. Stronger and more numerous than their coastal cousins, they managed for half a century more to contain British settlement to the coastal plain east of the mountains. Having subdued the coastal tribes, the English colonists set their sights on stabilizing the southern border, to provide some protection from Spanish-controlled Florida. Reporting tonight on the buffer colony of Georgia, is James Marshall.
Georgia gets geographically grouped with its southern neighbors, but similarities to the other southern colonies end with the geography, at least in its beginnings. Pine-forested Georgia, with the harbor of Savannah, nourishing its chief settlement, was formally founded in 1733. It proved to be the last of the 13 colonies to be planted, 126 years after the first, Virginia, and 52 years after the 12th, Pennsylvania. The English crown intended Georgia to serve chiefly as a buffer. It would protect the more valuable Carolinas against vengeful Spaniards from Florida, and against the hostile French from Louisiana. Georgia indeed suffered much buffeting, especially when wars broke out between Spain and England in the European arena. As a vital link in imperial defense, the exposed colony received monetary subsidies from the British government at the outset, the only one of the original 13 to enjoy this benefit in its founding stage. Named in honor of King George II, of England, Georgia was launched by a high-minded group of philanthropists. In addition to protecting their neighboring northern colonies, and producing silk and wine, they were determined to carve out a haven for wretched souls, imprisoned for debt. They were also determined, at least at first, to keep slavery out of Georgia. The ablest of the founders was the dynamic soldier-statesman James Oglethorpe, who became keenly interested in prison reform after one of his friends died in a debtor's jail. As an able military leader, Oglethorpe repelled Spanish attacks. As an imperialist and a philanthropist, he saved the charity colony by his energetic leadership and by heavily mortgaging his own personal fortune. The hamlet of Savannah, like Charleston, was a melting pot community. German Lutherans and kilted Scots Highlanders, among others, added color to the pattern. All Christian worshippers except Catholics enjoyed religious toleration. Many missionaries armed with Bibles and hope arrived in Savannah to work among debtors and Indians. Prominent among them was young John Wesley, who later returned to England and founded the Methodist Church. Georgia grew with painful slowness, and at the end of the colonial era was perhaps the least populous of the colonies. The development of a plantation economy was thwarted by an unhealthful climate, by early restrictions on black slavery, and by demoralizing Spanish attacks. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
The plantation colonies of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and latecomer Georgia, all shared certain distinctive features. Huge tracts of land, these outposts of empire were all in some degree devoted to exporting commercial agricultural products. Profitable staple crops were the rule, notably tobacco and rice, though to a lesser extent in small farm North Carolina. Slavery was found in all the plantation colonies, though only after 1750 in reform-minded Georgia. Immense acreage in the hands of a favored few fostered a strong aristocratic atmosphere, except in North Carolina and to some extent in debtor-tinged Georgia. The wide scattering of plantations and farms, often along stately rivers, retarded the growth of cities and made the establishment of churches and schools both difficult and expensive. In 1671 the governor of Virginia thanked God that no free schools or printing presses existed in his colony. All the plantation colonies permitted some religious toleration. The tax-supported Church of England became the dominant faith, though weakest of all in nonconformist North Carolina. These colonies were in some degree expansionary. Soil butchery by excessive tobacco growing drove settlers westward, and the long, lazy rivers invited penetration of the continent, and continuing confrontation with Native Americans. This concludes episode 3 in our 3-part series on the planting of English America. We hope you enjoyed watching, and stay tuned for our next Historytellers installment, where we investigate the unique blending of religion and early capitalism that would shape the founding of the northern colonies, and drive the industrial nature of the future United States. For everybody here at the Historytellers, remember, history is not a lecture to be heard, it's a story to be told. Good night.